Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Other Great Game, The Opening of Korea and the Birth of Modern East Asia, by Sheila Miyoshi Jager, narrated by Kathleen Li. Preface. One of the best-known struggles of the 19th century was the Great Game, when Russia's threat to British interests in India initiated a lasting rivalry and bloodshed that would continue until the beginning of the 20th century. While the dramatic geopolitical struggle between these two great powers has been the subject of numerous books, the Great Game in East Asia is less well known but just as remarkable. Britain did not play a primary role in this struggle, but it became aligned with a rising Japan, which did. Moreover, whereas the ultimate prize of the Great Game was India, the crown jewel of the British Empire, in East Asia, China, Japan, and Russia fought for control over the impoverished yet strategically important Korean Peninsula. The intricate chessboard on which this other Great Game was played at the close of the 19th and early 20th centuries caused two major wars, the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, that changed the East Asian region and the world forever. Since ancient times, China had held a position of supremacy as the Middle Kingdom. By 1911, 1 year after Korea became a colony of Japan, the Qing dynasty collapsed and Meiji Japan had risen up to take the Celestial Empire's place as the dominant power in the region. My narrative chronicles this great transformation in East Asia. The story begins in year 1860, because this was the period of Russia's eastward expansion, when Russia first came to share a border with Korea. Some may find this choice surprising. They might point, instead, to the decades of the 1840s and 1850s as decisive, when both China and Japan witnessed threats to the old order as they confronted the foreboding intrusion of Western gunboats on their shores. But I argue that actual transformation occurred in full measure only when Korea emerged from its isolation to become the object of regional competition. Russia's eastward expansion set in motion a series of events that not only fractured the previous regional harmony within the Confucian world order, but provided Western countries with both the incentive and the opportunity to intervene more vigorously in East Asian affairs. By the end of the 19th century, the United States and Japan stepped forward onto the world stage as two non-European great powers that would come to dominate the Asia-Pacific region, eclipsing the European military and economic powers that had prevailed before. This took place due to the widespread fear that a weakened China was about to be carved up by the great powers, and that Russia would absorb all of Korea and Manchuria for itself. So pervasive was this fear that earlier promoters of Russo-American cooperation, like Theodore Roosevelt, cast their lot with Japan and defined Russia as America's chief rival in East Asia. Concern over Russia's expansion into Manchuria and the breakup of China thus unexpectedly earned Japan new allies in its war with Russia in 1904 to 1905. It was this unwitting alliance between these two rising non-European powers during the latter half of the 19th century that set the stage for Japan's continental expansionism. The first of these conflicts occurred when Japan began to encroach on China's tributary state of Korea and succeeded in acquiring Taiwan. The second major war was waged by Japan against the Russian Empire and paved the way for Japan's takeover of Korea. In between these imperial clashes, Spain and the United States fought a war that left the latter in temporary possession of the Philippines, Guam, and a number of small islands in the Pacific. There was also the China Relief Expedition undertaken by the Eight-Nation Alliance, a multinational military coalition that invaded northern China in 1900 to relieve the foreign legations in Beijing from Boxer militia, and the Russo-Chinese War that handed over control of Manchuria to Russia in August 1900. As the insurgent power, Japan participated directly and indirectly in all but one of these conflicts, while China and Korea remained at the receiving end of the scramble for concessions and territory. These large-scale conflicts created a new sense of national identity and a more genuinely national politics, even in nations with much older pedigree. They also gave rise to a new cadre of elite economic and military reformers in Japan, China, Russia, and Korea, whose job it was to help navigate their nation's response to the rapidly changing environment. Their stories are the subject of this book. What follows is a narrative history in which I have tried as much as possible to capture the flow of historical action in time and to impart some feeling about the lives of the historical actors, as well as a sense of place in which they lived. This approach was due in part to an intellectual debt to two books, Rudyard Kipling's Kim and Peter Hopkirk's The Great Game, The Struggle for Empire in Central Asia. Kipling's 1901 novel, which made The Great Game popular, was set during the Second Afghan War and captures perfectly the paranoid mood of the Anglo-Russian contest. The phrase Kipling used, "Now I shall go far and far into the north, playing the great game," was actually coined by Arthur Connolly, one of the players of the game, who in 1842 was tortured and beheaded by the Khan of Bokhara. Kim was one of the first novels I read as a child, and I enjoyed it immensely. I read Hopkirk's The Great Game for the first time in university, and in one sitting. Hopkirk was a writer of the old school, an inveterate journalist, historian, explorer, adventurer, anthropologist, and I see my book as a kind of homage to both these authors. I begin my story with Russia's eastward expansion, an important theme. Traditionally, Russia has not figured prominently in the histories of China, Japan, and Korea. If Russia is dealt with at all, its contributions are noted almost perfunctorily, a side story to the bigger story of these nations' singular development and their relations to each other. Much of the history we will be examining in this book is a regional history, that is, an examination of how Russia, Japan, China, and Korea interacted with each other, with inputs from the Western powers. To the extent that I include Russia in this regional history, I wish to draw attention to its vital identity as an Eastern power. Much like the Great Game proper, the other Great Game was largely about war and conflict, another important theme in the book. I devote a considerable amount of space to describing military campaigns, recounting in detail some of the more intricate military operations of many key battles during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, the China Relief Expedition of 1900, the Russo-Chinese War of 1900, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. I believe it is important to flesh out this military history, partly because a detailed study of all four military campaigns and operations has not been extensively covered together in one book, and partly because I believe one cannot adequately appreciate this history without reckoning with the enormous consequences of these wars and their impact on societies. In the case of the Russo-Japanese War, that conflict changed the character of war itself. The sheer drama of this struggle, the huge numbers of soldiers and sailors involved, and the introduction of innovations, such as extensive use of barbed wire, rapid-fire weapons, and even poison gas, revolutionized the very character of warfare itself to usher in modern war that presaged the utter horror of blood and destruction of the Great War of 1914 to 1918. In my descriptions of these wars, I also wish to convey how they were experienced on the ground. At its deepest level, the resort to war signals the failure of political systems to settle human conflict, and to the extent that East Asia from the middle of the 19th century onward was an extremely violent age, the study of war must make up a significant part of that history. How soldiers and civilians alike struggled to make sense of these conflicts, and the lessons they took away from them, are a central concern of the other great game. I understand a modern East Asian order to be synonymous with the Westphalian system of modern nation-states with sovereign rights over their...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?